Hi, folks. This is Louis Hertham, the original Peter Abernathy. Hell is empty and all the devils are here on the Shadow TV Westworld podcast with Roger, Gene, and Big D.
Welcome back to Shadow TV Westworld, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Westworld. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons. Alongside me is my co-host, Ash.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive episode where we look back on this week's edition of Westworld and provide our thoughts and analysis 24 hours after watching the episode. So we've had a little more time to digest. We gave you our instant take on Sunday. Now it's time for us to dig into some topics a little more thoroughly. And this week's topics include a return to Westworld's central question, why Caleb is special, and what's with this new world. We'll also get in a couple of odds and ends and play a new little game I came up with called Explain Me This. But we're going to kick off with the biggest topic of the week, which is Westworld's central question.
I think it's really important for us to remember 4 seasons and what this show started out as. And I have to be honest, I had forgotten. And if it hadn't have been for this podcast, I would not have ever gone back and rewatched seasons 1 through 3 prior to this season. But I'm so glad that I did, because now as season 4 is kind of unfolding, and we're getting into the meaty parts of it, I think it's really important for us to connect it to the other seasons.
I'm glad you brought that up because I also did a rewatch prior to season 4. And I feel like a person who just jumped in on the season might think that this is a fairly superficial run-of-the-mill sci-fi show, but you get a lot of depth from the background on everything that we're seeing. And I think it's really meant to be seen as a whole.
It is. And we've talked about this before, that I think Westworld is a show that benefits from a binge model. I enjoy this show, including season 3, which if you listen to our podcast, I was not the most massive fan of. Even season 3, when watched in its entirety, is so much better than watched in these little bitty pieces. And the central question for Westworld, I think, and I'm not alone in this, I don't believe, has always boiled down to this idea of what does it mean to be human? This is that central question that's at its core. And in this episode, we kind of return to that question. And I want to talk about it in 3 ways, with 2 of our main characters, and then, of course, with our larger plot twist. Because for all of us that are like OG West weirdos, right, we've got to think about how each season contributes to the answer to this question. And season 4 so far is giving us a really unique perspective on that. So to start, I want to turn to Maeve. Maeve is our host. She's been on a really huge kind of hero's journey throughout the entirety of the series. We see her wake up in the first season. She really is kind of our cornerstone. She's our guide to understanding the host. She's our guide to understanding how human they actually feel for a lot of these seasons. And we were kind of returned to that. We've joked that Maeve has like superpowers, and is she serving any purpose anymore? Well, I'm glad to say that she did. In season 4, episode 4, I've rewatched it now 3 times, and I was blown away by how she's returned to that original position. We get to see her at her most human in 2 very important ways. The first is this friendship, this genuine friendship that she develops with Caleb. And the second is the way, because of that friendship, that she sacrifices herself for him. Both of those things are incredibly human characteristics. 1, to care for others beyond yourself, to love others, and then to sacrifice yourself for the people that you love. There's no other creature really, I don't believe, that would go against every single piece of our survival mode. And for Maeve, her survival coding, right? And so even her own longing to have like that connection with Caleb, that's what endangered them in the first place. We find that out in this episode where she taps into the grid, and that's how Charloris finds them. And for me, I really enjoyed seeing this journey end for her. And I know Bernard just used that big fan to dig her up, but like it ended in her mind. She chose to end it. And I think that's a really beautiful kind of addition to whether or not these hosts are human after all.
And the way we see those hosts has really evolved, at least it has for me. One thing about Maeve that rubbed me the wrong way as this season started was the catchphrases, the unnecessary panache, the outfits. And they really seem to have no place in the outside world coming from a fully sentient host that had had time to develop. But listeners pointed out, and they were right, that that is who Maeve is. Like, for a host, what they were written to be at some level is still who they are. They don't wipe to zero. They're not just a robot devoid of personality. So in episode 4, when she, grabs the guy and she says, "That's a day off for you, copper," I started to cringe. But then I smiled and realized, no, that's who she is. She is a fully fledged character that we've seen here, and that is her humanity.
I agree. And I think it's a really beautiful aspect of her. And I like the way that we look through her lens. Humanity looks good on Maeve. And it made me just kind of like feel better about how shit kind of our race is. And that brings me to the second of the kind of answers that were given here to the central question, which is in the form of Caleb, who is an actual human at the start of this episode and certainly has been throughout the entirety of the show. He ends this episode as a host, but I think we're supposed to start questioning, like, is he not human any longer? And that's the first question really that he finds himself asking Charloris in this episode about who he is now. And this is really, really important. Charloris responds to him that it's still him. And she says at least a version of him, but isn't that good enough, basically? The fact that he has all of his memories, the fact that he still wants the same things. He's still terrified about his wife and kid. He's terrified still of dying because he thinks that he's dying in those moments. So does that make him human still? And I think it's a really interesting journey for us to kind of add a complication to this question and to this debate because of the fact that Caleb is someone that we have seen only as a human that has been a good guy. This isn't like Delos where he's a bad guy and we see his fidelity testing fail and there was something kind of beautiful about enjoying his own self-destruction. This is a guy that we are supposed to like, that's a hero in our story that goes from human to host. And this is kind of a new turn for us in questioning whether or not Caleb still is who he's always been.
For this season, this seems to be the most direct proposal of this question, what it is to be human for Caleb. And it begs another question, which is why go to the trouble to recreate perfect copies of humans when humans are livestock, right? So we're seeing that humanity is being retained. We're seeing that there's a fidelity test. I would get it if somebody wanted a dead relative back. But Caleb, for all intents and purposes, is the enemy of Hale. And that points to a very important thing we learned in this episode. According to the Man in Black, Maeve is the last of her kind. And that would mean that Charloris believes or wants to project that all sentient hosts are gone. Like, she doesn't necessarily want hosts to be gods built in the image of humans, but rather she wants to be God, and then the rest of the world is just playthings.
And I think that's really brilliant. I think the point that you're bringing up there, because she doesn't call it our world, which is her narrative throughout the entirety of season 2. When she's still in her Dolores original host body, she says, this is my world. And that's a really important turn, and really maybe is the moment that she becomes the most human, in the sense that she's been basically corrupted completely by the power that she's been given and is only surrounding herself by people who will be, or hosts that will be subservient to her. And that is something that we see happen all over the world with really important people and really powerful men. And that brings me to the New World Order, because this is the last piece here that I think they're giving us some things to chew on with this question of what does it mean to be human? Because there's this really interesting mind fuck for us as viewers. And I mean that as a compliment. I love a good mind fucking in a great show like this. And there's this idea that we as viewers and the humans themselves within Charloris's world are now in a loop as well. Post-Tower, post-Fly, all the humans are now controlled by a mainframe of sorts. And that mainframe, that computer system, is our brain, the largest supercomputer that exists. And that supercomputer is infected with a virus, and that agency is taken away. And as a result of that, humans are on the loop in whatever storyline that Charloris or those that are working for her, we don't really have those details yet, but it's the loop that's being created for them. So what does that make the humans here? Because they're flesh and blood. They still can be killed, but so could the host. So are the humans even still human? Or are they more host than human? And the bigger question is, has she unintentionally or intentionally equalized the two races because of this, because of these loops that she's put us on? And I think those are all really important questions to ask. And I'm really curious to hear what you think, Jean, because after all of this, there's this moment that is one of the most beautiful and will go down as one of my favorite moments in Westworld, which is when the humans freeze. And it's not because they're frozen, because we've seen this done in other television series and in other movies, most recently The Matrix. But the reason it works here is because they freeze the same way the hosts do in season 1. That first time that a park employee walks in and says, seesaw motor functions, and the hosts freeze. The humans freeze in exactly the same way. And so are our showrunners giving us our answer here is what makes you human? Agency. And without that agency, are you anymore?
Westworld has also toyed for years with the notion that humans do and then rationalize. Basically, the school of thought that agency may not exist at all, that free will itself is just an illusion. You know you're going to eat that last pizza slice or drink one more beer. You just go through the mental charade of deciding. That entire process that you think is you making a decision, it's not really that. That's just a story you're telling yourself. The decision was already made. And if that's the case, then being human isn't about agency at all. It's more about behaving according to a set of coding and environmental triggers than anything. And as you said, Ash, that essentially is equalizing host and human.
It is. And, you know, there's this great idea that a lot of people have been writing about with this season, with the whole Christina, what we thought was Meta World, about how what we do as humans is a loop in and of itself. We talked about it on one of our previous episodes about how every morning I wake up and I eat egg whites and I eat turkey sausage and I eat a little bit of potato that's cut up. And then I do the same things and I follow the same routines. And as soon as we're done recording, my children will take baths at the same time they take them every single day. And, you know, we all exist on these loops, and I am super type A. And if I get off of those loops, I find myself in a panic. I'm not as productive and my life just isn't as satisfying. And so the whole time we've been on these loops as humans, but seeing it as a forced loop, it was such an interesting perspective. And I don't know, I was really hating on episodes 1 and 2, but if the rest of the season is like this, I'm loving getting back to these philosophical questions. And I hope all of you listeners out there that you write in as well, because I'm sure we've missed some things, but man, this is a really interesting question. And I forgot how cool this question was when they asked it in season 1.
And that concept of humanity, that concept of agency seems to be key to what makes Caleb special. In season 3, Dolores said that she chose him for his capacity to choose. But for you and me, that feels like kind of a lame answer. And we've asked in season 3 and season 4, really what makes this guy so special? Is he worth all the trouble? He's not a great warrior. He's not a tech genius. He seems pretty unremarkable, doesn't even have a great haircut. So I decided to go back to Caleb's origins. Okay, so for those people who forgot, and it's been a while since season 3, we know that his mother was a paranoid schizophrenic and she abandoned him as a child, but he decided to keep caring for her and paying her medical bills as an adult, even going to the point where he was taking jobs from Rico, doing illicit activity just to make money to pay her medical bills. We know Caleb served in the military, where he became distrustful of the systems that operate the world, and he picked up some nifty combat medic skills, and he suffered a pretty serious head injury. We also know that he killed his combat buddy Francis on Solomon's orders, but it was to avoid being killed first. And then he downloaded a virtual Francis he could talk to on the phone. By the way, Caleb's also killed a few dozen other people in his lifetime, but they're mostly bad guys. Caleb has some loose similarities to William in that he's infatuated with Dolores and he feels strongly about finding something real in the world. But is that enough? What really makes him different? Rehoboam identified him as an outlier, and Dolores did ultimately entrust Caleb with the controls to Rehoboam, giving him the free will, quote unquote, to decide man's fate. Then after choosing to make Rehoboam delete itself, Caleb joined Maeve on this world tour of blowing up Rehoboam sites until the final one, where he himself got. And then in this episode, we see she took him to a hospital. She left him to live a quiet life with the first woman he saw, apparently, Uwade, who later brought Frankie into the world. And then he apparently was safe until Maeve decided to Facebook stalk him and blow out all the electricity across an entire mountain range. And at that point, Caleb correctly guessed he was at risk and he needed to separate himself from his family. Interestingly, it doesn't seem like anyone was interested in Uwade, but Charlores' host seemed pretty keen on nabbing Frankie, which might point to a desirable genetic trait, or maybe that she's just conveniently pocket-sized.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought that up, because on one of my rewatches, I was watching and I was thinking to myself, there's so much about Frankie. They push so hard and heavy in the first episode that we met her about how she's so much like her dad. She's so much like her dad. And Uwade gets so mad and she's like, why does she have to be like you? She's going out here and shooting shit. Pretty heavy-handed. And so I think you're onto something there, that there is something genetically similar between the two of them that's something like, as Caleb says, where he looks at her and says, because I have something you don't. And we know that Frankie later was able to resist whatever this fly invasion was, because not all the children did it. And clearly there's some sort of immunity or like super agency or, something like that in their brains. But I think this is a brilliant, brilliant connection.
And thinking back to season 1, remember Dr. Ford talked about evolution is just a series of accidents, it's a series of mistakes. And so it could be that within the human race, within the human genetic code, these variables, these mistakes, either offer some protection or an evolution. So we finally learned in episode 4 that what the purpose was of the Temperance Park, or as Big D calls it, Prohibition World. Sounds like a lot of fun. The whole purpose was a super spreader event for the parasite and not specifically a trap for Caleb. Caleb was just a bonus. And we learned that Caleb died in the park, but Charlores has been running fidelity tests on him for about 2 decades and 278 iterations. That's a lot of investment. As you asked, Ash, what does he have that she doesn't? And I narrowed it down to 3 possibilities. The first one, maybe it's genetic. Schizophrenia runs in families. We know Caleb's mom experienced it. He's also suffered head trauma. Perhaps his mind could operate differently to the point that it's able to resist the flyborne parasite and the tones. I got to ask why any of that would matter to Charlores. The only thing I could come up with is that she wants to know why some people can resist. It's for science.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting there is we find out after the big fan digger tool, we find out that it's implied that the body's not there, right? Like that Bernard doesn't think that Caleb's body is there. Because you got to remember, guys, he's seen literally every possibility of how the world's going to work. So he might have come across Caleb's body at some point. And so this leads me to believe that Charlores took his body. They needed it in order to build his host body. And there's so much technology in this world. Who's to say that they didn't map his brain and they didn't try that first? And when she couldn't find it with the physical specimen, that she decided she had to go to these lengths to create the host and study him in that way.
I'm glad you brought up that tech angle, because my question next would be, if his physical brain is what matters, then why would she allow him to die at all? I mean, she already had him in the park, right? As Big D said, you got to have a controlled environment so you can catch him nice and safe, but then they killed him anyway. And maybe that's it. Maybe they figured they'd have enough to go on. Once they did their dissection and their genetic testing and their brain mapping, there wasn't enough, so they had to go through these cycles of fidelity testing. Another possibility, this one's mostly for Big D, is Dolores handed Caleb the keys to Rehoboam, and maybe that's what Charlores wants. But remember that episode 4 just showed us Maeve and Caleb blowing up the final Rehoboam site in Cancun. Also, I think Charlores would see Rehoboam as a competing intelligence, not a friend. I don't know that she would actually want Rehoboam around because it would threaten her world.
Right. It wouldn't just threaten her world. It would threaten her ability to create that world, right? Because Rehoboam, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, all of his predictions, I think it's becoming very clear that Rehoboam predicted what was going to happen with Charloris, that this was on the horizon, that she was coming her way. So if anything, like something that's sounding the alarm of what's coming, she could have never gotten to the point of even creating, Prohibition World or whatever we want to call the roaring 1920s park, a Westworld light. And I think that that's a really important point here. Charloris says to him, "You were always so important to Maeve and Dolores." I think we're seeing a little bit of a break in her armor here, that she is sentimental in some way. Think about the clues that she's given us this season about that. We know what she did with Teddy in season 2 and how sentimental she was about him. She's been sentimental about her father. This season, she's keeping Willie on ice because she likes to go visit him and torture him. And you and I both know, because we've been cold, heartless people before, that, apathy is the opposite of love. It is not hate. And you're not apathetic about somebody if you're constantly like defrosting them and refreezing them just to go fuck with them, right? So there's some semblance of fucked up sentimentality there. And now she's like, well, but Maeve and Dolores liked you, so I'm going to maybe keep you around and turn you into this to figure out why. We could be seeing maybe what one of her weaknesses is, that she can't get out of that aspect of her loop because she was inherently ingrained to be sentimental. That's why she took care of her father beginning in season 1 with Teddy Flood, with her painting, and with her father. We know that sentimentality is there. And I think it's really interesting that we're seeing it be translated differently, but that weakness of her loop still exists in her somewhere.
Always a key thing to remember, much like Maeve, is that every host still has a core essence to them, right? Just because they find sentience, it doesn't mean that they are now at 0. They are still someone. And that someone has traits that are unshakable, just like we all do. Again, getting back to what it is to be human. The final theory on Caleb, I'm going to thread the needle somewhere between light tinfoil and Big D's train to Crazy Town. And that's insurance. If Bernard can see into the future through repeated simulations, perhaps Charloris can too, or has some similar capability. And if so, she might know Maeve is coming. And what better defense against Maeve than a Robo-Caleb? For all we know, Charloris doesn't want the end of mankind any more than Bernard does. We're assuming that she would support the extinction of mankind. We haven't seen anything to back that up. Perhaps Caleb is her way of ensuring humans survive to be her pets. But the question then would remain, why leave Maeve's body at the construction site?
You see, and I think that's a really interesting plot hole. And I'm not using plot hole that I think like the showrunners did something wrong. I think it's just an answer we don't have yet, which is why. It's going to be kind of tied up in what Charloris says, which is that I'm paraphrasing, but she says something along the lines of, I realize I don't have to exterminate you. I just need to control you, basically. Like, she doesn't want to kill all humans, just like we talked about the vampire theory, right? It's that episode of Buffy that's the alternate universe where Buffy never came to Sunnydale and Cordelia gets therapy thanks to Anya. Love you, Anya. Rest in peace. The vampires don't want to kill all the humans. They want to enslave them. And that's exactly what Charloris is doing here. And clearly Caleb is something. And if it's not sentimental, maybe it is connected to Maeve, and maybe we'll find out next episode after Bernard revives her.
Everybody in this new world that we've seen so far in New York seems to be doing all right. Like, the worst case we have is, well, Peter jumped off a roof, so I guess he's not doing so great. And then you got the guy that we assume is living on the street and talking about the tower. You know, compared to today's streets, he's doing all right.
And these apartments are huge. I'm just going to throw that out there. I mean, like, they got some nice living space. And speaking of this new world, we want to kind of dive into what it looks like and what have we learned. And so there's different aspects. And guys, please know we're still piecing all of this together with you, but this is kind of what we've come up with of what we know so far. So you've got the beautiful dystopian, I love the fucking color scheme. Like, give me a world where everyone wears black, right? It looks beautiful. And then you got Mad Max out in the desert and the Condemned Lands as well. So let's start there. Let's start in the desert. So while we know for sure, as we had all predicted, that C is Frankie, nobody calls her Frankie. They call her C. And the leader she fights with and pulls a gun on is named J. It's very, very Men in Black, where everybody is just labeled by a letter. But I think it is important for us to think about why, because clearly they all had names at some point. But it led me to kind of ask, is this part of the rebellion? Do they have to have these code names or these new names, whatever you want to call it? Are the names too heavy in terms of identification or memory, or is there an intentionality to it? Maybe do they not remember their names as a result of their infection? I just think it's an interesting aspect that maybe we'll get a little bit more info on.
And perhaps the most important question is, are there only 26 of them?
Right. Like maybe they're cells.
Or do they move on to punctuation too?
Right. Well, I know you're joking, but maybe there's like cells where you can only have like 26 people in a cell, and then maybe like an exclamation point and a period and a semicolon or something, which I would totally want to be the semicolon. But the point is like there's something just weird going on here. And why is she C? Why is she not F? Why is she not Frankie? And then there's this dream retelling that happens. So in what I found to be one of the more chilling aspects of this episode and of the season so far, we get Maya, Christina's roommate. She comes in and she gives this depiction of this fly nightmare that she has. And in that, she describes this family picnic where she and her parents, they're overtaken by flies, herself included. And we know now that Charloris has taken over the children, and this may be an actual memory that Maya is holding on to as a result of her indoctrination or her infection, whatever you want to call it, which, by the way, I love that Westworld is like, it isn't too soon. Let's play on COVID-19 fears and talk about a mass infection. I think it's really ballsy, but it could be that Maya has a repressed memory and that this is actually real. And guys, that's fucking terrifying. I don't know if you all are fans of zombie movies. I love them. 28 Days Later, there's this scene in that movie where one of the guys describes a train scene, the subway station, where the zombies just start infecting people and the infection spreads through the crowd. They don't show it, they just describe it. And it's so much scarier, I think, when you don't see it. And so I think that Ariana DeBose does such a great job in the scene describing it. And the horror, really, of what Charloris has done becomes so clear in her retelling of this nightmare.
This is starting to convince me that Maya is a real person, but I'm still a bit skeptical of that. She never has a date when they go on date night. She never talks to the bartenders. I don't think we've actually seen her bedroom. She just seems to hang out in the living room all the time, despite the apartments being very large and for some reason, Christina having a Murphy bed. None of this shit makes sense in this room. I still don't know that Maya is a real person. And after the situation that we had with Frances in season 3, something about her is just off.
I don't disagree. And a lot of people are predicting online that she is one of the hosts that's there to find the outliers. So she's a host programmed in that way. And this is just the loop she's on because they think the outliers will find Christina for some reason. Like maybe and think about it. I mean, the guy comes, he jumps off of the roof. You got the other guy on the street. Like she could be a magnet for that sort of activity. So you may be right. And speaking of those hosts that are finding people, we obviously can assume that Bernard killed those people at the diner because they were hosts looking for people like him, looking for people like C. And we know also that drones are tracking them down too. So these people are always going to have to be on the move.
Can we talk about how much these drones suck? The drone sees Bernard clearly. Then he covers himself up. And I know he's seen into the future. He knows he's going to be okay and all of that. But like, it's looking at him. And then it's like, I didn't get a missile lock or whatever the fuck. So I guess he's not there. I have self-driving Waymos in my neighborhood that do a better job of spotting people than Olympiad's miniature Cylon Raiders.
I don't disagree. Although I did think the shot was pretty cool when Bernard disappears. I thought that was pretty neat. But did he really have to go and like catch the beetle and make the beetle fly to know which ridge to blow the fan at? I don't know. It was cool seeing that. And speaking of the Mad Max people, they talk in this episode about how there's outliers that have to go and be extracted. And so I think clearly we can assume that these are people who are awake, who are conscious, whatever. They're not controlled by the White Tower. They're not controlled by the sounds. But we have lots of questions. How do they find them? How do they become outliers? And this is an awesome duplicate of what happened last season with Rehoboam. So you already brought up that Caleb was an outlier. He was classified as an outlier by Rehoboam, where were people who just couldn't be categorized, or in this case, couldn't be controlled. And I'm thinking we're probably going to find that those same outliers categorized by Rehoboam are also the people that are going to be categorized as not being able to be infected. And this brings me to a question, and I'm sorry, I apologize, Gene, I'm putting on my tinfoil hat right now, but did Rehoboam predict the outliers as a good thing, and the people interpreting the results thought it was a bad thing? And so they took them because their futures couldn't be predicted. Man was afraid of it and turned the results of Rehoboam evil, because perhaps Rehoboam was showing them the people that were going to be the ones to resist, and the only way that human beings were going to be able to survive what was coming for them.
No, with all due respect, I think this is not that crazy. And listener Nick B wrote in this week about that parallel to Rehoboam and Solomon that we're seeing now with, the new leadership. And listener Mark Shepard in Minnesota, he started asking a lot of practical questions, which I find myself asking all the time. And I think you're asking too when we watch Westworld, which is like, how do they even find out about an outlier out in the middle of the desert? Do they have some sort of outlier 911? How do they travel to that person across great distances? Let's say the outlier is in New York. Do they just get up from the Nevada desert and drive there? Do they have enough gas to get there? Lots of questions like that I think that Westworld hasn't really quite covered, but they do stick in my mind. I am old and I think about these things.
I don't disagree. And we know that they're going to be in based off of the trailer. I know that one guy wrote in and said, please stop watching the trailers, but it's in the trailer. It's after the episode. I can't help but watch it. And they wind up in so they've got to be traveling some way. Maybe it's like in Obi-Wan, the show, there's like the Jedi like network where they go and they save people. Maybe it's similar to that. I also have some logistical questions about the tower in this world. Is it just New York that is overtaken by Charlores? Because I need some scope for this thing, because they pan back and I thought we were going to see just the island and no bridges, that like all the bridges were going to be bombed, like straight up like Batman, where like everything access to Gotham City was destroyed. I thought it was going to be that, but I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Is it just New York?
When that camera was panning across the river to the tower, I thought it was going to keep going and it was going to show us one of two things. Like, one was going to be the entire world is just fucking gone, except for New York, right? That she realized she can only control a certain amount of space, so fuck everything else. Or it was going to be that it pans out and we see there's towers all over the place, right? They're just everywhere. Knowing that Bernard, Stubbs, and the Cause are in the Nevada desert being observed by drones, I can only guess that Charlores' reach is at least continental. I don't know that there's a tower every 30 miles or whatever, but that there is some presence in major population centers.
When you think she could do like an app, you know, like they could like download an app so she didn't have to have these big towers.
I don't know how she has the time while she's also doing these 278 fidelity tests, unless there's multiple Charlores too, in which case, why would you keep reproducing yourself with the burnt arm? In that case, sentimentality. Fuck.
Yep. See? It all comes back to having a heart.
And amazing sleeves.
She's amazing sleeves. Well, and the final thing that I want to bring to kind of our attention here is I want to come back to Rehoboam. I want to reorient ourselves with what Rehoboam predicted. So old Rehoboam, he predicted that both a population collapse would occur and an eventual end of human civilization, two separate events. And if you look at the timeline, if we take the 7 years between seasons 3 and 4, plus the 23 that we now know we've jumped further in the future. So 23 plus 7 is 30, guys. We are right between where Rehoboam predicted those events. We're right in between the population collapse and the eventual end of human civ. So is this what Rehoboam saw? Was it Charloris and her flies? And if that's the case, is Bernard the key? Because remember what Rehoboam said. He was very clear that mankind would fall if human beings were left to solve their problems. If human beings had no intervention from any other entity and it was just us, we were fucked. But remember, Bernard is not human. Neither is Maeve. So are they the key to our salvation?
And there seems to be some debate about this timeline as well, whether it's the 7 years plus the 23 or if the 7 are included in the 23, depending on when Bernard went night-night. But the point is that regardless of where on that timeline we sit, we're still sitting squarely between events, right? So one event has happened, one event is still coming. That's where we find ourselves in season 4 as of episode 4.
Yeah.
Ash, I find myself often while watching these episodes screaming at the TV and yelling, why? And some of those questions get answered because they're legitimate questions that are pertinent to the storyline. And some of the times they're just stupid questions by me and I don't understand. And I don't think they're ever going to get answered. So I figured I'd go to the people who do the best job of explaining things to me, you and Big D. You're the one here tonight. So I'm inviting you to play a new game called Explain Me This. What I'm going to do is point out some goofy moments in the episode. And we could try to maybe piece together an explanation for the Westworld writers, do their work for them. Are you up for it?
I am so up for it, Gene Lyons. We need theme music. Da-da-da-da, dun-dun-da-da.
All I got's...
I'll take it. Dun-dun.
Okay, 1. We see Caleb grab a shard of glass and threaten Charloris, who is a host. And we've seen what hosts are capable of. She runs the damn place. Did he actually think he was going to be able to hurt her with that? Do you think it was actually a smart move?
I think he was using whatever was at hand because clearly he is a resourceful motherfucker. And I think that it was just convenient. I think it was convenient and he was going to slit her throat. And I wish he had because I think that would have been the smart thing to do. But yeah, it was lame. It should have been a gun.
What I was hoping to see, like you, was Caleb grabs a glass and he knows how to disable hosts. Like there's some weakness in their architecture and he used that anatomical advantage to put the glass in a specific spot, maybe an eyeball or something, and deactivate her. But I laughed out loud. I howled perhaps when they got to the construction site. They opened up the back of the laundry truck. She was just hanging out. That to me would have been a dead giveaway as Caleb. Something's fucking wrong here.
Yeah. The people in the helicopter are not my people.
All right. Question 2. In episodes 1 through 3, we see Dolores zip up her bed in the first 3 episodes. It is a Murphy bed. I assumed that the zipping up was crucial to keeping things on the bed or something. In episode 4, clearly it's for impact that she does not zip up her bed. So we know that she is off her loop. Can we think of a reason why a person would not zip up their bed?
Ding, 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 ding. Calling me, Gene Lyons. I actually have a theory here. So I had a roommate in college who walked in her sleep.
Okay.
And she slept in a sleeping bag that she zipped herself into at night because it was harder to get out of in order to sleepwalk. And so the first thing I thought of in the first episode when she zipped that bed back up is that she's a fucking sleepwalker.
I like it. And I did some research on Murphy beds to make sure this wasn't a critical part of it and found out that there is a there's a company called Betty's. And listen, if you're out there, you're not a sponsor, but you could be Betty's.
Yes, you could.
Get in touch with us. But Betty's, they make zippable bedding. Oh. It's great for bunk beds, dorm rooms. So get yourself a Betty's. You can zip it up just like Dolores. A lot of people have also said that maybe it has something to do with old Bill back in season 1, how he used to zip himself up. I like your theory a lot better. A little less morbid, a little more reasonable. All right. Question 3. We see Maeve fire a Thompson gun at the man in black. She's spraying with that thing. Her eyes are basically closed. Her shoulders are up at her ears, and she's not hitting a damn thing. Maeve is a host. She's a host that is sentient. She's a host that is battle hardened. Why is Maeve flinching from the Thompson gun's flash and recoil?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer here. I noticed the same thing. I thought maybe Tandy Way was just having a bad day on set.
You could get a stunt double.
Or just show, like, you know how they did that cool thing in like gangster films, not gangsta, but gangster films from the 1920s where they just show like the flash from the gun and you can't see the person's face behind it. Yeah, they could have done that. It could have been badass. Keep the change.
You filthy animal. And finally, the one that bothered me the most. Why are you using a giant fan to dig?
So here's my problem. Is I thought it was going to be like a Sonic thing. Like it was going to go boom, 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 and then like blow a fucking hole in the ground or something like that. But instead, it just looked like something we use like in Houston when like the heat index gets high. And it's like, you know, we're going to circulate the air here in the desert. It was a huge letdown. And poor Bernard then gets out there with like the shittiest shovel. And it's like, you couldn't have like blown the fan for another like 30 seconds to uncover Maeve.
And there's literally like 6 people standing around just watching. Not a single person helped. I was like, are they trying to punish him?
Yeah. X, Y, and Z. Literally, that's their letters. We're just standing there, you know, with nothing to do. And I don't know. It was lame. I guess it just gave us a chance for C and Bernard to have their little chat.
All right, Ash. Well, thank you for playing Explain Me This. Now on to the odds and ends. So these are just items that didn't really fit neatly into any other categories that we'd like to get to before we close out the episode.
Just want to give a shout out to the showrunners for some beautiful writing and the sense that they were able in this episode, and just one, to show and set up a loop of Maeve and Caleb and the loop that their friendship follows. So much like how Maeve helped Caleb win the war, Caleb gets shot. The same thing happens here. No, it's a knife wound, but still, it's the same ideas. They're still fighting the war. Caleb is still injured, and Maeve is bringing him to safety. And the juxtaposition of those loops that Maeve still finds herself trapped within, and the loops that we as humans perform daily, it was just really fine TV.
The most touching segment of this season so far was these scenes between the two of them in these loops, and that parallel between the first time he was injured and this simulated time that he was injured when he's already dead. And when you take on that additional dimension of the fact that this is Caleb in death, it gives it an extra gravity that I really appreciated.
Yeah, same. And I know we haven't given any love to Teddy Flood. And this was a big deal that Teddy Flood was back in this episode. So I just wanted to say one thing about a good old Teddy, which is I love the line and this idea from Teddy in this episode about what's real, where he says the only thing that's real are the stories we tell ourselves. And this is such a meta line because the hosts tell themselves the stories, the humans tell the hosts what stories to tell. Like, it's just this really beautiful idea. And we've talked last season, I did this whole thing about memory on an episode, about the way that memory works. And all of these studies that have been done that show that every time you remember something, it completely alters that memory. So once you've remembered something for like 40 years, it's nothing at all like what actually happened when the event actually occurred. And there's something both beautiful about that your memories become truly like your own, and something really terrifying about that. And so that just made me remember all of those things. And I really like that exchange with Teddy.
My Teddy moment was that lipstick replacing the can rolling to Teddy. Beautiful, sentimental touch. I even let out an aw. And it was really sweet to see James Marsden back. And their chemistry was so good in that scene where they're sitting across the table from each other. There are few moments where we get to take a breath and see two characters connect. I mean, we saw that a little bit in season 1. There was, of course, the Akichita episode, but very few of those moments in season 3 and now moving into season 4. We're allowed that. More soothing than levity that we often get is just these tender moments that Westworld pulls off so well when it attempts it.
And I know we might get some letters about this, and I apologize in advance, but I just think we'd be bad podcast hosts to not mention something that's super obvious, which is that Evan Rachel Wood James Marsden and Tandy Way Newton all look significantly older this season. And it just feels a little strange. I mean, Evan Rachel Wood and Tandy Way, they're so gorgeous. Like, women should age. I'm not saying they should get Botox, but like James Marsden, he looks so much older. And that's one of the things about this show that they're eventually going to have to deal with, is that like these hosts are supposed to never change. And he's clearly an older version of himself. And maybe they'll play on it smart and he'll actually be like a human Teddy or something like that, because humans do age. I just think it has to be said. I've been wanting to say it for 4 episodes now, so I can't control it anymore, Gene Lyons.
Yeah, to be clear about this, if this was like Game of Thrones, right, we wouldn't be making this comment because they age. They're people. These are hosts. They're supposed to be unaging, and that is what makes them different. One of the things that makes them different. So I totally get where you're coming from, because if you think about it, season 5, if it is greenlit, I know it's already in the story arc, that would be 2024 if they follow the same pattern.
So they're going to be even older.
They're going to be even older, yeah. One point I wanted to bring up, talking about getting letters, I'm going to roll the dice on this one. In this episode, Frankie, or C, she kisses a woman. And I got to say, it felt forced. And I'm not saying, oh, the show is woke, I'm not going to watch it anymore. And I'm not saying I mind seeing 2 women kiss. What I'm saying is the kiss itself felt completely out of place. And when you do stuff like this, it feels forced. It feels like virtue signaling. And I would say the same thing if it was a heterosexual couple. If you just had her kiss some dude out of nowhere right before leaving, I'd be like, huh? What the fuck was that all about?
Yeah, it felt like we need a moment here.
Next up, Hezitech, one of our viewers on YouTube, pointed out that in the scene where Caleb is running out of the Olympiad building, he says he saw Christina. Caleb passes right by her. It's in the lobby. So after he goes downstairs and he's leaving right by her, there's a woman. She's got like shoulder length or just past shoulder length, dark hair. It looks like she's wearing like a blue, black outfit like Christina would wear. I don't know if it's Christina.
Yeah, I mean, it looked like a woman. I don't know if it's Christina, but it definitely looked like a chick.
If you'd only stopped and kissed her,
then we would know.
Then we would know. And as a final note for our odds and ends, I wanted to point out that this team that did episode 4 was the same writing team that gave us episode 3. And interestingly, their focus stayed pretty much the same as episode 3. So following the same characters, following the same storylines, roughly. Episode 5 will be back to Lisa Joy, who co-wrote episode 1 and directed by Craig William McNeil, who directed episode 2. So my guess is bringing back Lisa Joy from episode 1 and Craig William McNeil from episode 2, they're not going to be following a pattern of 3, 4, 5 in the storylines. My guess is going to be we're going to either get a sort of standalone episode or one that breaks from the storyline of the past 2 episodes. So get ready for something very, very different next week. That's my prediction. So write in and let us know what you think. Host at shatontv.com or visit our website, shatpod.com/TV, and leave a voicemail using the SpeakPipe feature. Let us know what you thought about our overview of what's going on in the world, about what it is to be human, about what makes Caleb special. Try to explain me this. Tell us about your own odds and ends, things that you might have noticed. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Westworld Deep Dive. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for a Shat on TV podcast. The website is shatpod.com/TV. You can email us, host at shatontv.com, wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash and Big D, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us Friday for the Westworld Telegraph.